Welcome back, Nate.
Good to see you again.
Did you get some lunch?
I did indeed. Thank you. Hopefully I don't have any of it in my teeth.
And the Zoom's far enough away. We're gonna do our best not to, I feel like last year we definitely had some, one straight into the other kind of days. So trying for a slightly more civilized pace.
I have a strict policy about not talking during a no-hitter. So I feel like whenever something's good, we get breaks in, I don't want to, you know about that in baseball? You don't mention
Yes.
a no-hitter. When things
Very,
are going
very aware. I am similarly superstitious.
So I was like thinking, I wasn't going to mention that we got a break.
I see. Yes. Yeah. Now we've jinxed it. No, hopefully not. Yeah. No, I'm scant, and the media is really like lately they just like blast out the fact that it's a no-hitter all the time and talk about it. Like the taboo is dying, which is sad.
These things. So of course, I'm now coaching 8 and 9, 10, and 11-year-olds. It's like no hitters are not in our repertoire.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like
4 walks in an inning. That's what we aim for.
I've been unwinding by catching the Sox on TV, at the end of the day, fairly frequently lately. And Jordan's Furniture is advertising me like all your furniture free if there's a no-hitter after August 3rd. And I'm just like, someone could do a statistical probability calculation on that. And I'm sure they did. It's not very high.
So I think it was the 07 Sox World Series is what paid for my sister's living room furniture.
Oh, nice.
She actually went and did. She told me, she's like, I think they got it this year. And I was like, I don't know. They won the World Series and I got a text like 10 minutes later.
That's wild. That's amazing. All right.
Is this part of the conversation broadcast? I'm always curious about.
It may have started to be once the live on YouTube thing goes up. But whatever. We're not ashamed to be Red Sox fans.
That's right.
Okay. Where are we at in terms of your team? Because I want to get going pretty shortly.
Right. In terms of the presentation, it's me and Miriam, and I think the superintendent had mentioned that she's not able to join.
Yep. No, I know that.
We'll be able to jump right in.
Okay. So from your perspective, you are ready to go at this point?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let me just pull up my opening statement. All right. And we're all set. Is it Carrie? Carrie or Michelle, you guys just give me the heads up. Are we good to go?
Ready to go when you are, Madam Chair.
All right, fantastic. Okay. I'm calling this hearing of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee to order. For the record, my name is Hvac. I'm the District 8 City Councilor and also the chair of the Ways and Means Committee. This hearing today is being recorded. It's being live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. And it's also broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. This is one in a large number of hearings that we're having as part of the City Council's budget review process, both hearings and working sessions. And we encourage you to get involved by testifying at these hearings. So you can testify in person, you can submit a video to us to add to the hearing, and you can also send in written comments. The best place to find out how to do all of those things is boston.gov/council-budget. That's boston.gov/council-budget. But you can also shoot an email to ccc.wm. That's WM as in Ways and Means. So ccc.wm@boston.gov. So email there or go to boston.gov/council FY22Budget, and you can find out all the ways to testify, and we'll loop you in. And we're also going to be having a dedicated public testimony hearing focused on what folks want to see in the city budget and with our federal funds for an equitable recovery. We'll have one of those tomorrow night at 6 p.m. And a couple more 6 p.m. dedicated public testimony hearings more towards the end of the process on May 25th and June 3rd, both at 6. So like I said, we'd love to have you involved. You can also testify at the end of any of these hearings. And if you want to informally tweet us your questions, use the hashtag BOSSBudget, BOS budget. Today's hearing is on docket 0524 to 0526, orders for the FY22 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations for the school department and for other post-employment benefits. Docket 0527 to 0528, orders for capital fund transfer appropriations, and docket 0529 to 0531, orders for the capital budget, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. That's the whole set of our budget dockets, and the school department, which is where this hearing is really focused, has funds that are spread across those different dockets. So the topic of today's hearing will be the BPS school budgets. So some of our subtopics are weighted school student funding, enrollment projections, schools with declining budgets, the opportunity index, new investments, transformation schools, hub schools, and we'll be talking today as throughout our process about the use of federal funds for return and recovery plans in the schools as well. Presenting to us today will be Chief Financial Officer Nate Cooter and also the Budget Director Miriam Rubin. And I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues, Councillor Andrea Campbell, District 4, Councillor Anissa Sabi-George, at large, Councillor Ed Flynn, District 2, Councillor Liz Braden, District 9, Councillor Michelle Wu, at large, and Councillor Julia Mejia, at large. So as we've been doing, I think we'll jump straight into the presentation, and then so that we're maximizing the time for councillor questions. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to BPS CFO Nate Cooter to start.
Thank you very much. And as I open the presentation, I want to thank you and the council for having us back again to have the opportunity to present on the BPS budget. As you mentioned, today's focus is going to be on school budgets. And we always try and provide enough context in our presentations so that if there's somebody who is joining for the first time and trying to learn about the BPS budget, that they have the overall context for where we're going and how schools are funded. I think in a district with 123 schools and 100 or so, 115 of them funded on what we refer to as weighted student funding, this can be one of the more complicated hearings that we do in explaining how it works, how we have embedded transparency and equity into the funding process to ensure that every student gets what they need. And that is how we open every budget presentation with a statement from the Opportunity Achievement Gap policy, which is focused on every student and every school getting what they need. And this has been a theme throughout the pandemic where we have focused on the economic, health, and educational disparities that many of us knew were present before the pandemic, but have been revealed. And so as we think about this opportunity to invest in next year's budget, how do we align that in putting students first and focused on this budget to make sure they have what they need to find success? The highlights of this year, we were coming off a hearing this morning, so I won't spend too much time in the opening slides. Just want to highlight again, this is coming with a $36 million investment. And as it relates to the topic today, 100% of these new investments are directly in school budgets or in school services budgeted centrally. They are resources that you will see in school buildings and change the student experience for next fall. This, of course, is made possible by a 3-year, $100 million commitment. We're in year 2 with a $36 million increase in funding this year going to new investments. This is over and above our level service costs or the cost of doing what we did last year. And I provided a lot more context in the hearing this morning, but it bears repeating as Chairwoman Bach mentioned as well. We have multiple resources that we can bring to bear to solve our challenges and to meet the needs of our students. The first is the $36 million increase coming from general funds. The second is the federal funding and the stimulus funds that we've received, nearly $400 million that we can spend from FY22 through FY24. And then, of course, annually our capital budget that invests in our school facilities. While the challenge facing our district is daunting, we are excited to present this student-focused budget focused on the frame around return, recover, and reimagine. What we are seeking to do is return well, recover strong, and reimagine what is possible for our students. As part of that, this morning, the district announced a new commission focused on the $400 million in federal funding. That's led by Ava Mitchell, our new Chief of Accountability, who will be helping to set the strategic focus and ensure that we are meeting the needs of our students and also aligning this to what we think will be the strategic vision of our district in order to meet the needs of our students. The first focus of our budget, of course, is returning well. And how do we get students and staff back into buildings and return to some of the work that we needed to do to meet their needs? When we look at our students, we're thinking about them in three big areas. What are the academic supports that they need in order to address some of the unfinished learning and unfinished teaching that has happened due to the disruption? What are the health and wellness supports? How do we meet the whole child, connect with community services, and understand that they need mental health supports, they need health supports in order to get back on track? And then finally, the community supports, which I already sort of referenced. What we're looking to do is build more authentic partnerships across, leverage the great resources available in the city of Boston to be able to meet the needs of our students across academic, social, emotional health, enrichment opportunities, really the whole picture of what student learning and opportunities need to be. I mentioned this morning some of the questions from the counselors focused on the multi-year challenge that we've had around enrollment. And this graphic is from a conversation we had with the school committee in December around our enrollment pattern. I'm going to take a few slides and just go into detail on enrollment so you know the context in which schools are operating for next year. And Miriam's going to go into more detail, but it's also worth emphasizing 18.5 million of our new investments is going to stabilize enrollment. And so making sure that no schools had a change to experience. You're probably going to hear almost the exact phrase from Miriam when she goes and covers that slide, but it's something that we want to really emphasize. In a typical year, when you hear enrollment declines, you immediately start to hear from school communities that are talking about cuts to the student experience, having to lose a library para or having to deal with the loss of a partnership that was critical. This year, we've guaranteed that while we have changed the capacity at some of our schools, and that may mean core classroom staff has changed, that we have stabilized those school and the student experience so that all services are maintained in every school. Some important context, as I mentioned this morning, total actual enrollment declined about 2,300 students between October of 2019 and October 2020. This is again the third consecutive year of significant declines, and enrollment has dropped by nearly 5,000 students over the last 3 years. The most sharp declines have been in the early grades, elementary schools, which has been about 7% decline, about 1,800 students. This slide summarizes the grade by grade challenges Counselor Baker asked this morning about the high schools. There was a large cohort that just left high school. The class of 2020 was a large class and is not being replaced by a class of the same size because of broader demographic trends in the city, state, and the nation as a whole, which is that people are having less children. They're having them later in life. And so as they start to age in place, we're not seeing as many students enroll in the Boston Public Schools because there aren't as many students in the city. One of the things that was important for us as part of our equity strategy and our analysis at the start of this was we wanted to look at enrollment by race. And what we identified was that students of color are more likely to be in a school experiencing high enrollment declines. That is a trend that has happened in past years, but it was more pronounced during this last year. So given that the change in enrollment is correlated with race this year, stabilizing schools with declining enrollment we saw as an explicit racial equity strategy. In particular, you'll notice that there was a sharp decline in Latinx students. This is related to a top, again, I'm repeating some of what we talked about this morning, but emphasizing that we do see less families moving or fewer families moving to Boston than in prior years, that is leading to our decline in enrollment. That's more than families leaving Boston and going elsewhere. Of course, we also look across grade span and program type. So we want to look and see where the pronounced, I already talked about the highlights in the elementary grades. Across certain programs, we see about an 8% decline in general education programming. We see and are projecting fairly stable enrollment in special education. And then English learner programs is where you see the largest decline. And this was a question from Counselor Baker this morning. On the next slide, we talk about English learner declines, but we are seeing about a 2,500 student decline overall in terms of students who are categorized as English learners. And ELD level is the English language development level. It's basically how they have progressed on learning English as an academic language. Level 1 being those who are newest to learning English, and level 5 being those who are almost ready to progress out of the English learner support programs, what we sometimes refer to as former limited English proficiency students or FLEP students, or former ELs. The second chart on this page shows enrollment by program, and you see the difference between the program enrollment and the ELD level enrollment is that ELD levels 4 and 5 tend to not be enrolled in English learner programs, but we do see this decline overall in our English learners for next year's. The reason that it's important for us to talk about enrollment, of course, as I mentioned, as a weighted student funding district, also known as a school-based budget or student-based budget district, enrollment really drives our process. And so I'm going to hand it off to Miriam Rubin, our budget director, to talk about the relationship between enrollment and funding for schools at the Boston Public Schools.
Thank you. So as Nate just mentioned, these enrollment trends matter for a lot of reasons, but when we think about budgeting within our district and using our weighted student funding model, they matter a lot. And in particular, they matter a lot this year. So again, weighted student funding, just to recap, is also known as student-based budgeting, fair student funding, or student-centered funding. It's become a popular funding model for districts with complex and changing student demographics who seek to allocate resources in an equitable and transparent way. It supports schools in being able to build their budgets to best meet the unique needs of their students. And so the way that it works is instead of allocating staff or resources directly to a school, the model allocates dollars that are tied to students. Students get specific weights that are differentiated based on different student characteristics. This means, in its simplest form, the dollars follow students. The dollar amount per pupil gets multiplied by the number of students we're expecting to attend a particular school. And that then is translated into the allocation a school receives in their budget. So rather than starting with services and staff, we're starting by gaining an understanding of who the students are that we're serving through enrollment projections and what their unique needs are. And then we're providing funding accordingly. And as school enrollment changes, the student makeup and needs change, and then we can expect that funding levels can change through weighted student funding accordingly. Weighted student funding is structured to fund schools based in 8 student categories listed here. Students at each grade get a base level per pupil allocation, which you can see in the first row of this table where it says grade level weights. You'll then see that students identified in different categories get allocations that are added on to their initial grade level allocation. Every student in the district starts out with this allocation, and then the weights, just to be clear, are additive. So that means that a student with disabilities gets a grade level weight and then also gets the weight for students with disabilities. It's important to us that the categories listed here remain reflective of the ways that we want to ensure we are supporting students through our funding. And so we strive to regularly reevaluate and make adjustments to them in order to ensure this, and are continuing to do so this year as well. As we know, and as we've seen very clearly this year, while WSF captures the basic level of differentiation alone, Starting in fiscal year 21, we wanted to go be a strong foundation. So now schools receive as well as a coordinator of special education and a full-time nurse. Each school's base amount varies by enrollment and need, with higher need schools having a higher per pupil baseline amount. In for FY21, this foundation is more important than ever. And as we move to outline our investments in our recover section of this presentation, we'll focus on how we have not only built out the scope of this foundation through our investment in a full-time, which are intended to offset this decline, and also to provide additional support on top of the foundation. We have a set of designated resources under turnaround and transfer advantages and students in special education. Bringing us back to our focus for this year's budget on return, recover, and reimagine. Our focus for recover is to ensure that school communities have what they need, not only to repair the damage done by COVID-19, but also to create the conditions in which students and families can thrive, to less families picking schools with declining enrollment, then leading to more declines in enrollment, and on and on. These declines and the associated cuts have historically had a disproportionate impact on our Black and Latinx students, English learners, and students with disabilities. This year, we are making an investment to stop this cycle. Our students have seen enough instability within the current context of our world, and we know that it is our responsibility to mitigate that instability as much as possible. To that end, we have committed to ensuring that schools do not have to make the cuts that you would typically see with these types of declines. Instead, we have invested $18.5 million beyond our typical soft landing support to provide schools with supplements outside of weighted student funding in order to maintain services for students. While we have still had to make some difficult decisions around the capacity of our schools and have closed classrooms in places where longer-term enrollment trends indicated it was necessary to do so, this investment has gone to ensuring that schools don't have to cut the support and staff and programs that are so essential to the educational experience of our students. And on top of this, as we spoke about in our last hearing, we also proposed an acceleration of our rollout of critical supports for students and families by investing in 81 additional family liaison positions and 95 social work positions for next year. Just going into a little bit more detail about our family liaison positions and social work positions. Our new investment is building on the investment we made last year in our transformation schools by ensuring that all schools have one full-time family liaison in their building for FY22. The liaisons that were hired this past year are truly reflective of the racial, cultural, and linguistic diversity of the BPS community and have been able to build deep and authentic relationships with our families throughout this difficult year. They've been critical assets to the school communities that they work with, as they've helped families navigate challenges presented by the pandemic and connected them to community resources related to housing, food access, counseling, and more. We believe it is essential for families at all BPS schools to have trusted points of contact reflective of the school community to go to when questions arise, and that this investment is an important step in that direction. Our investment in social workers also builds upon that FY21 investment by moving beyond our initial investment in transformation schools to bringing at least a 0.5 social worker into every BPS school. As with family liaisons, we have worked hard to ensure that social workers are culturally, linguistically, and racially reflective of our students and are receiving the necessary training to be culturally responsive to our school communities. Social workers will be providing both individual student and family support that honors different methods of healing while working to address racist and harmful structures and conditions in schools, and contributing to the design and implementation of school-wide culturally and linguistically sustaining practices. And with that, we'll go back to Chief Cooter to talk about Reimagine.
Thank you. As we start to think about the third part of our framework around reimagining what is possible for students, we're having a conversation with our community about what this could mean and what it could mean to reimagine. It could mean that we're talking about things that are already imagined, but we have not yet completed. And some of the talk about facilities, we're not talking about new and innovative ways. We're talking about fulfilling a promise to our students that we've been talking about for years. We're going to talk about imagining new things that have not happened yet. And we're going to be asking them to think about new and informative ways. When we start thinking about that $400 million in new federal funding, it is, as the superintendent mentioned this morning, really a once in a generation kind of opportunity, so that we can start to plant the seeds in a better future for all of our students. We talked about this reimagining work throughout the district and throughout our schools, and thinking about it in the three categories I mentioned this morning. Thinking about facilities and learning environments. How do we facilitate the conversations around the district footprint? Inclusion strategies for special education and English learners. And then, of course, school-based investments to have them reimagine their partnerships, reimagine what opportunities they have as a community, serving a community together. We're going to be talking about the capital budget. The city is presenting the capital budget on Thursday, and then we will come back on, I believe it's the 18th, to talk about Bill BPS and some of the specific. What we are talking about and what will be included in this is launching a predictable cycle of new construction projects, announcing new elementary schools, and beginning to start to queue up our schools so that people know that this is not a one-time blip in how we approach new buildings, that we have a more predictable path. The second is that reconfiguring our buildings. We've talked about the standalone middle schools and the need to move them into new configurations, continuing to use them as buildings potentially for elementary space or to help supplement our 7 through 12 vision, moving schools to a K-6, 7 to 12 pathway. And then, of course, for those schools that will not be rebuilt on a near term, thinking about how to reinvigorate our existing buildings for a reimagined student experience, and leveraging targeted projects to get us out of the deferred maintenance. This is the prior administration, the Walsh administration, had done more to leverage MSBA and invest in our school buildings than had been done in the decades prior, but we still have a lot of work to be done. And so we think about possibilities. We're proposed to our community some of the things that we're thinking about. One of them is reimagining our K-8 schools towards K-6. Many of you may know that the Perry School in South Boston used to be a K-8 school and is now a K-6 school. What we can think about doing is utilize the unfilled 7th to 8th grade seats in some of our K-8s, and instead expand K-0 and K-1 seats, fulfilling our promise to 3- and 4-year-olds throughout the city to have better access to public schools. While also then thinking about the high schools and reconfiguring our middle schools as we expand the 7 to 12 high schools and develop a cohesive strategy to really reimagine what our promise is around 7th and 8th grade. If we expand 7th and 8th grade as in high schools, as we're doing in Charlestown High School and in East Boston High School, we provide students in 7th and 8th grade with access to more rigor, more content-specific teaching, and more co-curricular and extracurricular activities as well. And so we're planning to roll out a timeline to be able to say to the community when you can see the changes to our schools and school buildings so that we can fulfill this cohesive pathway. A lot of this work has been paused because of COVID. It's been difficult for us to have a community conversation, but starting on the 12th at school committee, we're going to be kickstarting that or relaunching that conversation in a much more rigorous way. Of course, our plan is to have a conversation around this. We mentioned at the start of this that we have launched a commission to evaluate different proposals and set aside, figure out how much of the federal funding should be targeted towards this reimagine. We know that 20% of the federal funding needs to be set aside specifically for targeted academic supports. That is, of course, the floor. It is not the ceiling of how much should be invested directly. We've already done significant investments in mental health supports and community-based partnerships through family liaisons, but we're looking really to foster innovation and partnership with schools so that those who are closest to the students have the strongest voice And doing so means that we need to develop the process and build out the teams to be able to support schools in reimagining what is possible for their families. With that, I just want to note again, one of the things that we do to ensure equity and transparency in our budget process is by publishing all of our resources online. You can go to bostonpublicschools.org/budget. After each of these hearings, we'll be posting these presentations and translating these presentations. And you can find all of our budget documents translated into the 9 BPS languages available online. And as Councilor Arroyo asked about this morning, bostonpublicschools.org/explore-budget is a tool that allows you to dive in deeply to the data to find out how we are using all of our resources, and it tracks it down to how many students are served and what the cost per pupil is for all of our services. So I encourage you all to spend some time on that website. And with that, I will turn it over to Councilwoman Hvac.
Great, thank you so much, Nate. All right, we're going to go straight into council questions. I'll defer mine to the end. The order for colleagues is Campbell, Asabi George, Flynn, Braden, Wu, Mejia. Councilor Campbell, you have the floor.
There we go. Thank you, Councilor Bach, and thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Nate, for the presentation. We'll jump right in because I think there's a time limit here. What's the time limit? Just so I am mindful.
I usually raise my gavel about 5 minutes in, and then I give you all another couple of minutes after that. So
God bless you. Thank you, Councilor Bach. So on this, first of all, I appreciate the length of the presentation with respect to this issue around declining enrollment. I'll just sort of jump in with questions given the limited time. Do we survey families when they're actually leaving BPS to get a sense of why they're leaving? Because obviously we know many families are leaving the district because they are not satisfied with the level of service, the quality of the programming or instruction, or they don't get a pre-K seat, or they don't get into an exam school, right? We know it has to do with that too. And so curious if we survey parents to get a sense from them as to why they're leaving. My second question is around more data. So do we have a list of the schools that are seeing the greatest enrollment declines? And if so, what are those schools? And where are they sort of, not only what are the schools, where are they located? And then my third question is having to do with the Edwards School. You know, earlier today we talked about it closing. I didn't know that. I knew that it was slated to be closed because I'd gone to visit and had a wonderful experience actually visiting the principal there and the team there. And they were talking about this difficult choice. And where I think I was a bit frustrated was in a couple of budget cycles before, we were talking about stabilizing, right? Schools that are experiencing declining enrollment. But what was made clear is that it's very difficult for the district, frankly, to give those schools experiencing declining enrollment the resources they would need to be able to provide an excellent education. And I include not just great academics, wraparound services, sports, all the things a parent would want for their child. So really would love to hear more about the process with respect to the Edwards. It was slated to go in that direction for years, didn't happen. How much money was poured into that school to keep it stabilized before ultimately closing it? And what has been the engagement with families and parents with respect to that very difficult decision? How were they engaged in that process? And then my last question, obviously this is going to be a continuing trend, enrollment declines. And I think we're seeing that in the midst of COVID. And it's going to need an immediate response, right? It can't be 5 or 10 years. And while we, of course, are going to have to push to improve the quality of schools, et cetera, and much of what was in the reimagining slide, and with all due respect, there are so many great plans and studies that have been done in working groups with respect to reimagining. I think where the frustration is that parents and folks want to see these things implemented. We want to see universal pre-K. We want to see 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds have seats. We want to know what the barriers are, and we want to close those immediately. So how are we going to deal with and grapple with declining enrollment, this trend, in a timely manner? It can't just be the stabilizing piece. Really wanting to hear some more thoughts and specifics on that and those trends. Thank you, Councilor Bach.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, great questions. I'll start with the I suppose the easiest one, which is we don't currently survey families when they are leaving. For our high school students, when they withdraw, we do have withdrawal codes where we know we're responsible for tracking if they transfer to another Massachusetts school or if they transfer out of country. That's part of our dropout tracking. But we don't have any formal exit survey, a sort of qualitative piece about what families are choosing and why.
That's right.
And I think that's an area that we don't have a lot of information and we need it to do those sort of exit surveys. The second question you were asking about the list of schools that are seeing the greatest enrollment declines and where they're located. We do publish on our website school by school. In the weighted student, it shows a school by school comparison. It shows every school. So the change in sort of what we call weighted enrollment shows sort of the composition of student change. For each of those, we certainly could attach the highlighted that students of color are more likely to be in a school that any schools that's continuing to spread our resources thinner. And so we do need to make some of these structural changes. We need to, the standalone middle schools were the ones that we had highlighted as a big problem. They tend to be the schools where we saw the largest declines initially in particularly general education enrollment. And so we anticipate announcing the timelines on the other standalone middle schools and what their transition plans will be. Because there are two parts to stabilizing the student experience. There is making sure that the resources are there, that you have the teachers that can teach science and math, or funding an arts program or funding an athletic program. And then there's having enough students to actually participate in a robust community. And what we're seeing in some of our middle schools is despite the fact that we have maintained their funding, the enrollments are declining to the point that the school leaders are saying, we're having a hard time maintaining the student experience and there's no amount of money that can fix it because there just aren't students there. And so we need to make those changes to make sure that we're investing smartly, but also that we're making sure their students are in schools with a robust community of their peers and are in a school experience that is robust. And I also feel the pressure of that gavel, so I'm going to stop talking there. I turn it back over.
Great. Well, at least, we can get back to the larger trend question. I would like to at least have a response on how much.
At the start of the school year and announced that they're closing at the end of the school year. So they actually phased out one grade and closed that program capacity this year. In terms of family engagement, there was, you mentioned Principal Larissa Doherty, who is a fantastic school leader, has done a great job of communicating with families and supporting staff. And she led a number of engagements with families. And then we had a number of other meetings. I can get the list of meetings that we held with the school community so that you have sort of all the information that we were providing. And then also supports the students and staff to be able to help them transition to the next school. And there's been times where we've met with high schools that are expanding 7th grade next year and 7th and 8th grade next year to meet the needs of those students as well. I don't have that list with me right now, but I will we'll send it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and we will definitely follow up with the detailed info on the Edwards for Councilor Campbell. We would love that. And yeah, and just to counselors in general, we will definitely do a second round. I'm not trying to curtail people's chances to ask questions in the hearing, but I do want to let everybody get to their first round before we extend. So next up, I think, is Councilor Asabi George, and then Councilor Flynn, and then Councilor Braden. Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I know that we'll probably speak about this in, again, greater detail in another hearing, but I'm curious about the impact of weighted student formula and the decreases, but especially in students experiencing homelessness. Obviously, we've spent all of my time on the council, especially through these budget seasons and series, talking about students who are experiencing homelessness, sorry, the dog, and looking to make sure that we continue to support those students. I'm curious what efforts have been made by the administration to increase support of this particular population, especially through weighted student formula, given that many of our families and students who are experiencing homelessness are struggling, especially right now during the pandemic. And then what are we doing to track families experiencing homelessness? And obviously the child is the student that we're most concerned about. And are we seeing any increases in that population during this time?
I'll just briefly mention that we did continue to invest in our homeless weight, and thank you for your advocacy on that. It is an important group for us to be able to monitor and support. The family liaisons have been a critical resource for being able to connect families to different services and supports throughout. We do have more students experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity throughout this pandemic, and so it's been a particular point of focus for the family liaisons. Miriam, I saw you.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because of the process this year where we were really focusing on understanding what schools needed in order to maintain level services, we had a lot of conversations throughout the budget cycle process with schools to understand more specifically what the funding for homeless students was going to, so that we could kind of earmark it for that on the front end. So I think that there's a lot of effort being made to kind of strategically plan how to use that funding going forward and be able to maintain it for next year.
No, go ahead, Miriam. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I do have a follow-up.
No, go for it.
So, a number of years ago, we started to really look at the numbers of students in each one of our buildings to make sure that some of that funding would follow the students to that building. This last year, and especially at the end of last school year into the start of this current school year, you all did a really good job at understanding what your student needs were in each of those particular buildings. Are we using that information to better calculate the weighted student formula, or perhaps add like an added category?
Yeah, we haven't revised how we sort of calculate it and fund it from a weighted student funding perspective. But we have used that information about how we use that funding to support those students. And I would note that I believe it's the 511 hearing that homelessness and HERN will be part of the hearing topic, and that the staff will be there to answer more detailed questions. But, I think one of the things that one of our challenges with weighted student funding is that we are always looking for objective measures for different data points when we go to fund schools. And so that comes in sort of conflict sometimes with some of the more qualitative information that schools know about their students. And so one of the things we're committed to is that a student with a particular need or experience at one school is getting the same per pupil allocation as a student in another school. And so as we start to learn more about students, what we try and do is replicate that information across other schools to see if there are better ways. I will also just say, and after this, I'm going to the Opportunity Achievement Gap Task Force to talk about the finance team's goals for this next school year. And as part of that, we are committed to doing another comprehensive review of weighted student funding. We're in something like the 11th or 12th year of weighted student funding. So we're gonna revisit that and identify, are there ways that we can either improve or modify weighted student funding? And this is an area that we will definitely be looking at as well.
Well, one thing, there's some conversation today about enrollment numbers and projected enrollment. We see the decline for sure in the number of students in BPS. Within those certain categories, I imagine that students experiencing homelessness, especially over this last year, that's an added vulnerability, added instability. So if we're looking at, and I don't know whether this will prove or disprove some point that I'm trying to make, but if we're looking at who are the students that are unenrolling from school or not logging in, or, we'll talk about the persistent absenteeism, can we create a weight within that group, understanding and realizing that that student in particular, or that type of student, that profile of that student needs additional supports. And if they're existing at higher numbers in certain schools, then that would demonstrate that to me.
Yeah, absolutely. We have, weighted student funding started with a high risk weight. And the high risk weight started initially as a 9th grade weight for students who are at risk of dropping out using research that came out of Johns Hopkins around course taking, attendance, and behavior. And then we've added the homeless weight, of course, in the last few years. There's been conversations around foster care as another sort of unique challenge. When we launched the Opportunity Index, it was meant to get a more robust category of need that complemented students experiencing economic disadvantage, which was measured by our poverty weights and our homeless weights. And so those are all sort of things that we look for and say, what are these indicators? What is their correlation to academic challenges? And then can we track it consistently and should we fund it differently? And we have really, in weighted student funding, there are really, if I were to oversimplify it, 2 categories. There are those weights that pay for the staffing that's needed to run the program. So your grade level weights, the English learner weights, the special education weights are meant to fund a staffing model on a per pupil basis. And then there's the weights that are not directly linked to a specific intervention, homelessness, economic disadvantage. Those are meant to just be able to provide more resources to schools. And in particularly the Opportunity Index our original target was to say, what are the schools that are unlikely to be able to fundraise or unlikely to have a lot of community resources that they can bring to bear? Let's target those schools. And that's why we fund partnerships through that Opportunity Index. And so these are all the different ways, and those aren't tied to a specific service expectation, but it's more meant to provide resources to students we think need more resources, and then to give those resources to the schools and say, tailor this to the needs of the students because you know them best.
Thank you. And I see the gavel, so I'll just close with at least this round with a comment. We see the declining enrollment, which means, we're holding schools harmless. So we're funding now per pupil at basically a higher rate because we're holding schools harmless, yet still unable to give our kids the things we need. So finding a better balance between creating that foundational budget at every school and then adding on top of it some of that weighted student formula, I think has to be, when we see these declining enrollments, has to be the way that we look forward in a much more, in a bigger and more real way. Thank you for both the thoughtful presentation and the conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Asabi George. Next up, Councillor Flynn, and then it'll be Councillor Braden and then Councillor Mejia. Councillor Flynn?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Bach. And thank you, Nate. I guess my comments or questions revolve around some of the infrastructure improvements that might be included in some of that federal funding that is coming in, and specifically many of the schools as we head into the spring and summer with the weather temperatures going up. Tell me about the HVAC systems in, generally speaking, throughout BPS. Will some of that money be used for HVAC systems? That's a critical issue that the council always deals with, especially at the end of the year, in the beginning of the year. The heat might be on or the AC is not on. Talk about that for us, Nate.
Yeah, when we think about the conversations that I've been hearing or requests that we've gotten around the HVAC in schools, there are really 2 categories of schools. There are schools with existing HVAC systems. We do have money in part of our capital repairs program that is intended to be able to upgrade those HVAC systems and maintain those HVAC systems. The second category of requests that we get are schools that do not have sort of centralized HVAC systems, air conditioning, or air handling units. Some of our older buildings built before World War II. Some of our buildings were built before World War I as well, including the school that my children attend. Those buildings, to retrofit HVAC and put them in, the costs are prohibitive. And so we would look to those schools to be upgraded at a time when we would be able to do a full renovation or a new build for those school communities. And that's why we have focused the capital budget this year, not only to have capital repairs, but to begin the launch of the program to build new elementary schools, to be able to get ourselves out of those old and aging infrastructure buildings that can't be upgraded to be 21st century schools. They can't get the basics like HVAC, and they certainly can't get gyms and auditoriums and libraries, the things that have come up time and time again in our conversations around facilities.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Nate, and I understand the challenge that you have. But what I'm saying though, is if we have several $100 million federal money going into BPS, our students still going to be learning in rooms that are hot during the spring or early fall. It seems like that will still be the case. Is that right?
Yeah, there's not additional upgrades that will be in place for spring and summer of this year. That the existing, we did a lot around air circulation for to respond to COVID, but there are no additional upgrades in the works.
Okay, here's my question then, Nate. What are we going to do for those students so we make the environment acceptable for them to learn? They deserve to learn in a healthy environment, and you can't learn in a healthy environment with the heat on or the AC not on. So what do we say to those students and their parents? How are we going to help them?
I appreciate the directness of that question. It's a very difficult one. I would say we have an environmental management system that is how we monitor the temperature in school buildings and respond to that. That is something that is in the capital budget for an upgrade for us to be able to do better environmental management. And so if it's a matter of turning up the heat or turning down the heat, that's sort of an easier win. The bigger challenge, which is if you want, as we approach the hotter months, or as we think about summer school, we have tried to place our summer school programs in buildings that have air conditioning to be able to facilitate those programs. Obviously, we don't have enough buildings, and not all of our buildings have those systems. And unfortunately, the only way to get there is new school buildings, which takes significant time and resources.
But are we in the process of identifying the schools that need upgrades, but even though we're not able to get HVAC systems now, are we able to get them temporary assistance such as fans or stronger air conditioned systems, portable AC systems?
We definitely have fans for every school. That was part of the rollout of air exchange in all the buildings. So we have a significant number of fans that we purchased this year. We have not looked at portable air conditioning. We have not planned to roll out portable air conditioning. That runs into multiple challenges around not just simply the cost of operating those, but also the electrical infrastructure of the existing building and its ability to withstand that many air conditioning, sort of either window mounted or sort of in the room air conditioning. So I think we always have a balance, and Councilor Savage George was talking about the balance between the foundation for quality and then weighted student funding, and how do we balance that? There is a balance between how much of our capital budget goes towards sort of upgrading the experience of our old buildings and how much goes towards investing in new buildings and getting ourselves out of operating buildings that are 100+ years old. And so I think, current families obviously are going to be focused on how do we upgrade the student experience now, but we can't let that crowd out our investment in new major renovations, so that in 5, 10, 15 years, we're in a different place as a district. I think that's the sort of deferred investments in new buildings that we fell into 10, 15 years ago that has created the problem that we're in now.
I appreciate that. I just I wanted to stay on top of this, on top of this topic, because all of us on the city council always receive calls about this issue, and we're always trying to figure out how we can help. So, preparing for it now, getting fans and getting AC systems, getting water available for students. I was in an environment in the Middle East that one day it was 140 degrees. But what I'm saying about the schools, though, is, if the school building is 100 degrees and 90 degrees, at what point is it not helpful or harmful to the student really to learn? So I'm just trying to think about ways that we can really be proactive and help these students, because it's a problem we deal with every year, and it doesn't go away. But Nate, I know you're trying. I know you're thinking about it. I know you're looking at solutions. I appreciate your honest answers, and hopefully we can continue talking about it and come up with a good plan. Okay. Thank you, Councilor Block. Was that the timer?
It was right on schedule.
I planned it that way, Councilor Block.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn.
Thank
All right, Councilor Braden, and then Councilor Wu had to step away. It'll be Councilor Mejia, and then we were joined some time ago by Councilor Michael Flaherty at large as well. Councilor Braden.
Thank you. I'd like to explore the question of decreased enrollment. I'm wondering, do we track the number of school-age children across the city, regardless of what school they attend? Just to get some measure of what the population is, and a potential school population that we have to win through holding up the wonderful services of BPS. That's one question. I also had a question about the Horace Mann enrollment. Apparently, we looked at the numbers for financial year 2011. The enrollment was 142 deaf students. And then in financial year, this projected enrollment for this year coming is 72. That's a dramatic drop in enrollment. So would love to understand what's going on there. Is the decline due to out of district placements being decreasing, or inward in placements from other districts? Are they declining, or what's happening? That's a dramatic drop. I also wanted to know how we are supporting the families of young deaf children, infants and toddlers. I worked at Perkins School for the Blind in their preschool program, and they had an infant toddler program, which was a pipeline to support families to get their kids ready for preschool, first of all, and then later as getting readiness skills so that their students could go into an integrated classroom. I just wonder, have we got such a pipeline support system to support our infants and toddlers with deafness in the city? And I also think that it's critical when a baby is born into a family that with no experience of deafness, the critical support for the family in terms of orienting them to the deaf culture and teaching them ASL, and just and not seeing the deafness as a medical issue to be fixed, but also to hold it up as look at it more from a cultural and social perspective rather than a medical issue. And then also, if our deaf students are attending other BPS schools in the district, how are they being served? Do they have a deaf education specialist? Do they have one-to-one paraprofessionals? Those are some of the big questions. I also had a question about the Winship School in terms of there was some question of adding. There was parents are very keen to add a 6th grade over there. I was wondering, are there plans to increase to add a 6th grade to the Winship School? And that's it for now. Thank you.
Great. So the first question, you were asking about total enrollment in the city of Boston for school-age youth. And so as the the legal education agency in Boston, we do have an obligation to track all school-age youth and know where they're enrolled, whether it's homeschool, charter schools, parochial, Metco. We have that data. We get that report and check it on an annual basis. It's not something that we have sort of as frequently as our standard enrollment. We have analyzed that, and the term you were looking for, we call it the capture rate, which is what percentage of school-age youth do we capture as BPS students. And we've seen the shift in capture rate over the last 10 or 15 years as charter schools have expanded. We've also seen, as a response, parochial school capture rate decline in the city of Boston, both in response to some of the controversies that happened in the Catholic Church around 2000 and on that time frame, and also the expansion of charter schools. So if you look in the latest Bill BPS report we did, which was a phase 2 update, we published neighborhood statistics and showed the capture rate for each neighborhood by BPS schools and other schools. And so that is information that we have. You then started asking questions about the Horace Mann School for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. As you know, I've been able to spend a lot more time with that school community over the last few weeks and learn a lot about them and learn from them. What a tremendous school community, and one that we are committed to. We are excited to be submitting them for the MSBA new school program, core program in this open period right now. And so we are looking to build them a new state-of-the-art facility to serve their students. There has been a decline in overall the number of students who have been identified as having a hearing loss or in the special education system. So the 160 to about 80 students that you mentioned over the last 10 years is a decline in that population in Boston overall in BPS. But you're also noticing, and I thought you said it well, and I'm going to defer to the hearing on special education so that you can hear from Ethan Donald Burns, our head of special education, more about this. But certainly there are hearing loss as a special education category as a disability, and then there's the deaf and hard of hearing community as a community and a culture, and a deaf culture. Part of the dual language program that they've talked about is about deaf culture and sustaining that and supporting that. And so we need to think about the school in both ways. And it's important to reiterate that being in a school for that celebrates deaf culture, that does dual language, ASL and English, is important for supporting those families. They do have what they call the infant parenting program that works with local hospitals for families to identify families who have an infant who is born either deaf or hard of hearing, to connect those families to services, to connect those families to the community, and to do instruction and teach ASL. And that's part of the program. And so when we look for space for their swing space, we've had conversations about how do you maintain that space for that program, which is a critical support for the community and a great service that they provide. And so I don't have the numbers right now about students leaving the district and being placed out of district. We tuition in a number of students at the Horace Mann from other districts. Most notably, Lynn Public Schools sends the most students to the Horace Mann School. So I don't believe that we are sending many, if any, students outside of the district, but I would have to verify that and get that information for you. I think I hit all the questions you asked. But for you.
The Winship, 6th grade, the Winship.
Missed one, I apologize. We have held off on announcing the 6th grade at the Winship as we've gone through the conversations around the Jackson Mann and Horace Mann. I would say we are planning to announce the next round of K-6 expansions and 7-12 expansions next fall. So there are a number of school communities. We've heard a lot from the schools in Roslindale. We've heard a lot from the Winship School. They will not have a 6th grade for this fall, and our plan is to announce the next round of 6th grade expansions which may include the Winship in October, which gives families time to change their enrollment choices before school choice starts shortly after that. So that's the timeline in which you should expect to hear more information about sixth grade expansions at our elementary schools.
I also had a question about, and I'll see how my time's going, about the enrollment at the Brighton High School. Has it stabilized? And, you know, the school's under new leadership. Andrew Bott is doing a fabulous job over there under difficult circumstances with COVID. Just how's it going with Brighton High?
Yeah, I would just reiterate, the head of school, Andrew Bott, is a tremendous school leader. We've got a lot of strong school leaders in Brighton. And we have not seen an increase in enrollment. Brighton High School enrollment and assignments are down right now, but we are seeing new registrations down sort of across the district. So it's not necessarily an indication of Brighton, but more an indication of what families are watching. I think one of the theories that we've sort of been watching is families were waiting to find out if we would be fully in person in the fall. So a return to in-person learning this week is a big signal for us as a community that we're hoping will translate into new registrations. But enrollment has been down in Brighton, and it decreased this year again, and it looks like it's projected to decrease again next year. But we have made significant investments to stabilize the student experience there, particularly as head of school Bott takes over and provides the leadership that they need.
Very good. Thank you. I think that's all I have for now. I'm sure I'll think of more later. And we've got plenty of time, many more weeks to talk.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. All right, next up is Councillor Mejia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our office has been working closely with a number of advocates in the education space, and I wanted to just give a quick shout out to Edith Bazil, who has been an amazing advocate for students with special needs. We have a clear need to make up the learning losses obtained this year, especially among students who are operating in a system that was never really designed for us to succeed in the first place. So I noticed that in the depiction of the enrollment and funding cycle starts with enrollment decline. And I think this places the emphasis on parents and students who are either aging out of the system or looking for better opportunities. So if we're talking about interrupting that cycle, I think it'd be a good start for us by reframing where the problem lies. And, you know, I just wanted to make note that last year during these hearings, I recommended that we do exit interviews so that we can determine why our families are opting out. So Nate, to Councillor Campbell's point, I do think that it's something worth considering and investing on. But here's a few questions. I'm curious what is being done to support Mckinley students in particular. You know, it's a feeding school. In many ways, folks believe that it's a feeding the school to prison pipeline. Most of the students end up in DYS. And so I'm curious, with up to $77,000 per student, I'm just curious about what our return on those investments look like. Can you go further into the detail about the $18.5 million being spent on stabilizing schools with declining enrollment? Where is most of this money going towards? And is it to support programming or personnel? We're seeing a reduction of 3.4 in FTP positions at Mckinley. Given the high opportunity index identified by BPS, can you talk about how that decision will impact Mckinley's opportunity index? Since February, 32% of Mckinley students have been absent of all learning, according to school district figures. Can you talk about how chronic absence impacts enrollment figures? And to Councillor Campbell's point about providing services in our schools, professional development is an important part of programming being offered in schools with a large number of Black and Brown students, and helps stop the cycle of poverty. It looks like professional development programming is being cut by 38%. Can you explain that cut and how will that impact students with high opportunity index? And then I do have a question in terms of just staffing, and I'm just curious as to whether or not any investments on making sure that our schools are culturally reflective of the students, especially around staffing and hiring more educators of color. Do you think that that will help reduce the declining rates of transferring out of our schools. Just curious about what that would look like. And then one last question, how much work is being done as it relates to enrollment and MECO so Black students won't have to continue to leave the city and travel far distances for a quality education? You know, over the last 50 years, this has been definitely kind of the go-to for many parents. In fact, you know, as soon as we get our birth certificates, we run down to sign up for MECO. So I'm just curious about what we're doing to compete with that. That's a lot. So let's see how much we can get through.
In some ways, I think you may have just asked about one of the core challenges that Boston has, which is how do we confront issues of equity and race as it relates to a school choice system? And I think that's a difficult conversation. I'm not sure I'm the right person to field that question, but it does play out in the budget process. And so what we know is that families since for quite some time have been choosing schools based on a number of factors, some of them education-based, some of them not. And that what we see as a result when we start talking about enrollment declines is schools with students who are serving disproportionate students of color, students with special education needs. We see those as the schools that are chosen last. And that may be reflective of quality or it may be reflective of other factors at play. And I think the best thing that we can do is invest in quality teaching and ensure that our schools are great. I think Councilor Saiba George said it earlier, it's every classroom in every school. That is a bold task, but is one that is part of what we're doing. The way that we're doing that this year is twofold. We are investing in ensuring that every school has social workers and family liaisons. This is raising the floor. This is raising the foundation for quality, that guarantee that if we're operating a school, it's going to have these resources in it. The other thing that we've done is stabilize the enrollment so that when families leave a school, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are seeing a decline in services and programs. In some cases, it is about programming. It's about partnerships or field trips and other items in the school. And sometimes it is, to your question, about personnel and maintaining personnel. Could be somebody who serves as a dean of students, or it could be somebody who is providing social emotional supports outside of the classroom in a variety of different roles, or it could be a partnership like Playworks or City Year. We've made sure that we can maintain those partnerships across.
Who would be the right person to answer some of these questions in regards to the racial persistent lack of representation in our schools?
Yeah, so the question about hiring and so the recruitment and cultural diversity team, Sarah Daly's leading that. That is the focus of another hearing, but I will say that they do continue to make sure that we are recruiting and retaining our teachers of color. That includes ensuring that we are the employer of choice for any new graduates programs. There is a para to teacher pipeline that is intended to help support our existing employees. And then retention is a huge factor as well to make sure that our teachers of color also maintain and stay in BPS. And so
thank you. And before my time is up, because I don't want to get the gavel without answering the question specifically to the Mckinley, is there any way we can get to some of those answers?
Yeah, so the Mckinley School, I know you know this, but for those who don't, the Mckinley is a school that serves students with severe emotional and behavioral disturbances. And so it's students who have experienced trauma, students who have a track record or sort of a history of attendance issues or behavioral problems. And so, you know, the $70,000 per pupil that we spend at that school is about a higher staff to student ratio to be able to provide more mental health supports, social emotional supports at that school. As you know, there is a new school leader there this year, Cindy Nielsen, who was our head of special education. As she knows the school well and is designing, we don't fund the Mckinley School on weighted student funding. They're funded as a program school. And so any changes that you see is done in collaboration with the school leader to make sure that they have the resources that they need. And of course, we know that they also need an investment in their physical building. The facility as well is something that the superintendent has emphasized as well.
Yeah, so I'm just really want to get at just having a better understanding about the absences that we have seen at the Mckinley and how that impacts enrollment figures. And I'm just still curious with they're going to see a cut, right? In their I think it's a 3.4% reduction. And so can you talk about how that will impact the opportunity index for Mckinley?
Yeah, the 3.4 FTE reduction at the position reduction at the Mckinley is a shift in some of the staffing that's provided. In terms of the overall spending, it's like I said, we do it in partnership with the school leader. So it is partly a shift in their enrollment and partly just sort of looking overall at their student needs. The opportunity index sort of score for the school would be pretty high because it is a school that serves kids that are extremely high needs. So on a per pupil basis, I don't believe that their funding is going down, but this is reflective of sort of a shift in some of the enrollment and the needs of the students. Miriam, I don't know if you have any additional details you want to add about the Mckinley or.
No, I think that's pretty accurate because since they're not a WSF school, all the changes that have been reflected were closely worked on with the school leader.
Is there a dashboard that we can all just take a look and see, just kind of like what is the return on investment? We hear a lot about the money that is being spent on all of these amazing initiatives, but just kind of like what are the outcomes? You know, where is the data that goes to show, you know, how many. I know you have really great information about student graduation, but I'm just trying to see where can we just keep track of our return on investment? Like, where is that like clearly stated? We spent $3,000 to do this, and as a result of this, we've been able to do this. Like, is there anything like that that we can point to and see and explore and dive into? Because you know, I hear a lot about return on investments here, and we feel like we hear a lot of millions of dollars here and there, but just kind of like we still keep seeing the same problems, and it just not. I went to Boston Public Schools, and I'm a Boston Public School parent, and I feel like the only thing that changes are the outfits that we wear, but it just I just don't see it, and I'm just curious about where is that? Where is it? Where could I find some real hardcore numbers and data on the return of every single dollar that we're spending on all of these amazing initiatives?
The short answer is that we don't have that kind of rigorous sort of return on investment analysis, and that would be it is one of the bigger challenges in education. That's such as the Boston issue. There's no sort of standard way of thinking about return on investment, mostly because when you, in the traditional finance sense, when you're talking about return on investment, it's easy. It's always translated into, if I spend X dollars, how many more dollars do I get in return? But in education, oftentimes we are investing across a suite of outcomes that we're hoping for. So how do you compare an initiative that improves attendance with an initiative that changes the dropout rate, or one that improves English versus one that improves math and science? The steps that we have taken that I think are critical. First, bostonpublicschools.org/explore-budget. I risk of nerding out. If you go to that tool, you can really dive in. I think that might be where you got your 77,000 per pupil for the Mckinley. Otherwise, you were doing some great math from the budget tables. But the Explore Budget tool takes every dollar and breaks it down about how we spend it. So you can see what activities we're spending money on and how many students that activity supports. That gives you a cost per pupil.
I know I don't want to get you all choked up in here tonight.
I get very emotional talking about the data. No, the only thing I'll say is Dr. Grants is doing incredible work around the strategic plan to align then to outcomes and specify what outcomes we're going to get for each of those activities.
Yeah, and
that's the next phase of the work. And then combining into a return on investment is going to be our next challenge after that.
Yeah, and I know that Council Bach is going to put me on mute in any second, but I do want you all to know that as much as I'm going to go hard on just the parent voice and equity, is that I'm really looking at accountability, and not just accountability to the district, but just overall. And while it may not exist, it doesn't necessarily mean, just because it's hard doesn't necessarily mean that we can't figure out how to. And I'm sure that Councilor Bach, as the chair of Ways and Means, will probably already has a table that will hold us accountable to how every single dollar is being spent in BPS. And I think, you know, while I approved the budget last year, and I definitely want to support the investments that you are going to advocate for this year, for me, I'm going to be hyper focused on making sure that every single dollar matches to the cents of the impact that we're going to be able to make, because people are frustrated, and it just doesn't seem like these investments are really producing the results that we keep approving every single year. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Next up is Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll just rapid fire, just a few additional questions. The first one is, how are we managing school enrollment? We've seen a decrease, obviously, in years past, but more importantly, I think in the beginning of the year, I think that we saw that we had a drop of somewhere in the vicinity of 5,000 students, and at the same time, parochial schools saw, I think, a 4,000 uptick in enrollment. Part of that probably was COVID driven and who was open and who wasn't, but I want to know how we're managing school enrollment as we continue to see it decline. Second question is, what, if any, new investments are being made to Madison Park High School? I take sort of a personal offense, I guess, and umbrage to the fact that the best vocational school is in Worcester. Boston, we're the capital city here in the state, and we boast of having the best colleges and universities. We've got great partnerships with our building trades, and we've got folks coming here, bringing their companies here, and we need a pipeline. And at some point, Madison Park, quite frankly, should be the best vocational school in the state. So what, if any, new investments are going to be made to make that finally happen? Third is, what foundational student services are budgeted centrally? I'd like to get some clarity there. And also, what, if any, new strategies are being undertaken to get the charter school reimbursement? So we have a student that will start in a charter school, and obviously the funding follows that student to the charter school. And then after a relatively short period of time, parent, child decide to leave the charter school, come back to the public school, which is great because we take and educate everybody, but the money doesn't flow with the child, and we need that reimbursement. So again, what, if any, strategies are being undertaken to get that reimbursement? So those are my straightforward 4 questions.
Your first question was around what are we doing to manage the decreased enrollment? So I think in this year, we did work with schools to take capacity offline, meaning if they had 3 third-grade classrooms last year and they only have enrollment for 2 third-grade classrooms this year, we would close that third-grade classroom, and you would see a decrease in FTE at that school. But what we did was maintain the student experience. So oftentimes when we see a decrease in enrollment, there are smaller changes that schools have to make. We did more to stabilize that in years past. I think that does create a risk for us going next year as we start to think about what enrollment may look like. And so we have been monitoring enrollment pretty closely, as always, but we will look, now that we've announced the 5-day in person, we'll be continuing to track our enrollment and registration. New investments in Madison Park, it's funny that you mentioned Worcester. At the risk of outing myself, I'm originally from outside of Worcester, and I was saying to Miriam in the break that the Worcester Vocational School that has become the sort of talk of the state, I think, has caused a lot of us to look at Madison Park and question, what are we doing around Madison Park? We do have money to do a study for Madison Park to see how we should align it to the vocational programs that's in our capital budget. And we do need a plan for the capital infrastructure for Madison Park. It is one of our more challenging schools to think about rebuilding, both because it is such a specialized educational space and it is so large. So when we think about where Madison Park will go, I don't think we can necessarily think about swing space. I think we need to find that parcel that we're going to build on. In terms of new investments, there aren't any new investments, particularly in Madison Park for this year, but I will say we have continued to see increased enrollment in Madison Park over the last few years, and it's a good sign that students are returning and the work that they've done to improve. Foundational services, student budgeted centrally. There's a lot that fits into that category. Broadly speaking, there are some, the services that we consider in that are, of course, all of the transportation services, our school services budgeted centrally. Custodians and facilities costs, they're all budgeted centrally. Those are not things that are expected to be on the school budgets. Special education costs for individualized students. So one-to-one paraprofessionals, things like occupational therapy or speech therapy. Those are things that are allocated out on a per pupil basis with resources. We budget them centrally and we provide them to schools and maintain centrally all of the allocation and supports. Those are probably the biggest categories. I think when we start talking about school services budgeted centrally, there becomes oftentimes a blurred line of what is considered when we have centralized coaching supports. We consider that central office. That's part of our role as a central office, is to provide coaching supports. But you'll find those coaches in schools providing direct supports to students. I feel like I've plugged this a number of times, but it's another great opportunity to say the Explore budget tool on our website is the best way for you to go and find out the details about all of those services. And then finally, charter reimbursement. The big change that happened to charter reimbursement in the last few years is if a student enrolls in a charter school and they have special education needs and need to be serviced in a school and the charter school cannot meet those special education needs, when they come back to the district, we can bill that charter school for those students. So if a student gets a seat because you know that they hold a lottery, and let's say the student is a student with autism who needs ABA services, applied behavioral analysis, is a service way of providing services to students with autism. If that charter school does not have those services and can't provide a program that meets the needs of those students and they re-enroll in BPS, they pay our actual costs for servicing that student. That's a big shift in the way that the charter funding worked. And as it is now, there are 4 different checkpoints in the school year where if a student leaves a charter school and comes back to us, the charter school stops receiving the tuition for those. So it's right now, I believe it's 4 different points in the year that affects it. And so that is advocacy at the state level. And you know, the IGR team continues to work to advocate for better, more favorable funding, because I do not think the charter school funding model is an equitable funding system. They serve disproportionately lower needs students and less English learners than a district, and yet they receive the average district cost. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done with charter funding. With that, I'll turn it back over to you. Sounds like I got all the questions.
Thank you, Nate. Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you, Councilor Flaherty. Thanks so much. All right, it's to me now, and I guess I wanted to start just by asking about the Tobin School, which is the one elementary middle school in my district. It is down a little bit for the year, and I think when I look at it that maybe it's lost a classroom because it's sort of projected enrollment is down from 429 to 403. But I just wondered if you could, it looks like they had 2 social workers last year. They're down half a social worker. And you know, I think we talked last year, Nate, about the fact they're high on the opportunity index. And They're one of the schools higher on the opportunity index that sort of, when you throw everything together, is a little bit lower per pupil than some. So I just wanted to check in on that school community and sort of get a little bit more context about their budget this year.
Yeah, I'm gonna let Miriam take the details on the Tobin school. She certainly knows it better than I do. I would just note that when you look at the enrollment 429 to 403, despite the fact that that may be about a classroom worth of students, it's likely across multiple grade levels. And that's a great example of a school where they would have had a decrease in enrollment, but not able to take capacity offline because it wasn't concentrated decline in any specific grade. But Miriam, that's just generally sort of one of the things to talk about with enrollment, but I'll let Miriam answer the specifics on the Tobin.
Yeah, and I'm just double checking. I believe the social worker, the allocation hasn't changed. There was an error on one of the documents that was produced, but it should have been updated. So we'll make sure you're looking at the right one, but they had to, and then they were getting to this year. We had a waiver process for social workers. And so they're one of the schools who is going to be reallocating a portion of their social worker allocation to something else because they felt like they had enough support at the school. So can talk more about that if you're interested, but
yeah, what are they reallocating it to?
I think they had, there were a number of schools who reallocated it to a CLSP coach, who's going to be doing kind of a bridge of work between social emotional support and then also instructional coaching for teachers. And that was that waiver process is really, it was a comprehensive review of kind of the systems that they have in place already to determine whether they can reallocate. But that shouldn't affect what you see. It should be the 2.0 allocation that they got.
Yep, I got it.
The other thing that's happening at the Tobin school is they're continuing to phase out an English learner program. In this year, they no longer have a grade 2, what we refer to as SEI or sheltered English instruction class, and so they're reducing by the that SEI teacher FTE. So it's a case of a programmatic change that's happening at the school.
Right, and isn't that the second year? I think that programmatic change was happening last year.
Yeah, it's a phase out. So as that last grade of SEI students moves up, we will sort of phase it out and not replace it in the years after. And it started last year with the grade 1 phase out.
Yeah. Okay. All right, that makes sense. Sorry, just skimming through my questions here. And then the Mckinley, so again, it might have to do with the fact that it's a program school, but when we looked at it, we didn't see any social worker allocation there. I would expect that they'd have significant behavioral specialists. So I'm just wanted to clear that up.
Yeah, so with the family liaison and social worker investments, we met with each non-WSF school to kind of determine whether they needed that additional allocation. So they had the option, and some schools received it, but in the Mckinley's case, because they had kind of the support already baked into their school model, they didn't receive an additional allocation.
Got it. Yeah, and I'll just say, I just want to echo, I know Councilor Mejia's pushed on the Mckinley. Obviously, 2 of the 3 campuses are in my district. They're both older buildings, I think, and it seems like, you know, a weird mismatch of older buildings, also perhaps quite a lot of space though, proportionate to the student community, which I think can make people, it can make you feel like you're sort of weirdly in this extra space. And I think we really don't want our students like that to feel like they're in a holding pattern. And so, and I don't think that the issues that the recent newspaper coverage has highlighted are new, really. So just something, that I would really like to partner with you all thinking about that as a joint operating, but also facilities play. And we do have those 2 sites. So thinking about, is there a dynamic way to do something for both the middle schoolers and the high schoolers, like together on a site, or like, I don't know, but just, I think it's something we should be creative about. And then sorry, I've got too many questions here. On the enrollment declines front, yeah, I just want to push back a bit, Nate, on the idea that it's like the global thing and the you know, like folks having children later. I just feel like there are school districts in Massachusetts that are growing in enrollment, and ours is not one of them. And we are growing in population, which has some interaction, right? It's like, okay, yeah, people are having fewer children than when the triple deckers were full of like 5, 6 kids. But we're also like, we've also got a lot more people in Boston. So I don't know exactly how the math all cashes out. Certainly in my district, obviously, we've got some very low capture rates in some of the neighborhoods that I represent. And so it's sort of, I both agree with Councillor Campbell and Mejia about the need for that qualitative info. And I also kind of feel like we have the qualitative info, like we all hear from families that are making other choices. And so, I don't know, I worry about a story where we tell ourselves that declining enrollment is just an inevitable demographic fact, because I think that it obscures the things that I do. It's not that I don't hear you guys suggest, like talking about them. We talked about them a bit in the last hearing, but it's like, to me, it's like, maybe some of it's demographic fact, but we should just bracket that and focus on the levers that we actually have some capacity to pull, because otherwise, you know, we're in a pretty difficult long-term position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have sort of two sort of thoughts on that. The first is we do see a decline in the number of live births to Boston residents over the last 5 to 10 years. And so that has affected our capture rate and the number of students 5 years later who we see enrolling in K2. We have also seen a decline in our capture rate, so the number of students that we are getting from those cohorts that are being born. And we have heard, since I started at BPS over 10 years ago, the same sort of stories about why families move out of the city and when they move out of the city. And so we do see families exiting the system at different points. And so it is both true that we are having a decline in school age population in the city, and that because there is a competition for school age youth in the city of Boston, that despite this decline, it's not an inevitability. We can and should get students to enroll in BPS who are choosing parochial or Commonwealth charter schools. In other districts that have either not as many or any parochial schools or have no charter schools, their number of births and their number of kids are more directly related. So I do think that there's more that we can and should do to make sure that BPS is the first choice for families in Boston. And we see that for some of our schools and not others. And so learning from what we already know works and investing in schools is part of what we're doing. And so there's an investment in foundation for quality. We need to invest in facilities. We know that these are things that are having families leave. We are seeing early evidence that changing grade configurations and creating a more predictable pathway is keeping families in Boston. I will say it is one of the things that is nerve-wracking, having gone through it myself. Not knowing where your kid's going to enroll is anxiety producing. And so every time we enter into a lottery, it creates some families who just don't want to participate in that. But we know who is able to opt out of that. And so it creates, again, going back to Councilor Mejia's questions around race and equity, I think this gets to some of our core challenges in Boston.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, you know, I'm just alarmed when I look at the slide where you say, you know, our K0 to 5 enrollment has now dropped by 12.4%. Because it would seem to me like that's a leading indicator. Those smaller class sizes get older. And then we've got, so it's just like, so that's much scarier than the averaged number overall. And I guess it just feels like a kind of, yeah, it just feels like a red alert kind of thing. And I think it's worth saying, you know, to Councillor Mejia's point earlier, you know, I think one of the problems, and, you know, that I think we should just acknowledge, right, is that, like, on the one hand, everybody wants return on investment and impact. On the other hand, there's a lot of advocacy for inputs. Like, there are like things people want to see because they think they lead to impact, and then they may or may not lead to impact, right? But a lot of like advocacy, and I'll say this is also true on our political side, right? Like the things that we push for are like the things we think will make a great school that will then result in folks staying. And there is a tension, right, between the fact that a system that kind of doubled down on the schools that were driving higher enrollment would be very different from a system that tries to even out the impacts of declining enrollment across our schools, right? So you know, and I think you know this, and I think that for several years now, we've been saying that hard conversation is coming. And then we've put that on hold because with COVID, we're hopeful that the particularly cataclysmic decline from last year is temporary. But I don't know, it just feels like, I guess the reason that I really want to highlight it is because it feels like that is the like direction things are careening. And then we have this like big one-time infusion of federal money. And if the question of how to use that big one-time infusion of federal money is not how to fundamentally change the trajectory we're on, we're missing the actual plot here. And I almost worry that we could be so focused on the sort of like the effects of COVID that actually will will be mitigated within 6 months, right? The kind of, because there's going to be a lot of transitional challenges. Then there's the question of like, what are the longer term effects? But there's also like this question of like, what's this longer term story that we're in with the school system? I don't know. This is, I mean, this is more opinion than anything else, Nate, but.
No, but I just want to, so a couple things. I want to go on your last point though. I think that's really, and part of the conversation, certainly the superintendent has started at the risk of well, saying more than I should, but you talk about that we want to use this 400 million to make changing and lasting changes to our district. That is a difficult conversation to have. It is an important and strategic conversation to have. And speed of deciding gets in the way of the more strategic. So as we get more pressure to get the money out the door to schools, the less we're going to be able to say, what are the real major pivots that we can make as a district? So if you want to support that big conversation, I think it runs counter to some of the conversations we had this morning about when are we going to see the full plan for ESSER spending, because it takes us to have some conversations. I would also say some of those difficult conversations we've been talking about, they're coming for years. And then they were paused because we're going through a global pandemic. We're not waiting to see if things get back to normal. We're saying now's not the time to have conversations around launching major consolidations or school closures, changing high school students. Like, we need to stabilize their experience because everyone's just gone through a collective global trauma. And this is not how you then have a conversation around school configurations and engage with the community. We're just now coming up and sort of getting our eyes, I don't even think our noses above the waterline from what the collective experience for families are. And so we want to have that conversation with school leaders who are doing everything that they can right now to support students who are back in person this week. So if I try to have a conversation around configurations with school leaders, and we have a couple conversations that we're having this week, and you can just see the collective stress on their face. And so there is a certain extent to which we are asking for time, not because we are just trying to delay or obfuscate, but because as an organization, as a city, it is a difficult time for us to launch these big conversations. And the other thing I just want to say is I think you're talking about the red flag of early elementary enrollment. You are 100% correct. That is a red flag for us because K2 capture rate is the biggest point at which we get families in BPS. It's starting to become K1, that if we don't have them enrolled in K1, that we don't tend to see them as part of our cohort moving up. And so those decline in elementary enrollments are a foreshadowing of what we're going to see in the conversations we're going to have around high schools in, I can do the math, 8 to 10 years. And so we need to have a pro-enrollment strategy, and we need to also recognize that we need to capture students early, which is why the superintendent has been emphasizing early childhood, 3 and 4-year-olds, making sure we have more programs in BPS, expanding the access there. So obviously these are huge conversations and important conversations, but I just wanted to sort of flag how we're thinking about some of them in this broader context.
Yeah, no, and I take your point. It is literally the week we're back in school. I think that I mean I'll just say my push on we need to know how we're spending this money is really most focused on FY22 funds. And I do think there's a degree to which, to the extent that you are going to use funds in a fiscal year, frankly, there's something slightly wild about the fact that in terms of the city budget cycle that we approve funds on June 30th that start on July 1st as it is. And to then say, oh, and then some of these funds, like, we're not really ready to talk about it. I do think there's a point at which, like, if funds are actionable in a fiscal year, we've got to be talking about them before the fiscal year starts. And I think that first tranche of 123 million, you know, like, I mean, right, that's sort of ESSER that goes back to December. We didn't know we had the second 2/3 coming, right? But that also matches up with the FY23, FY24 thing. So I want to be clear about what my pressure is on this. It's about specifically FY22, and we're also making an FY22 overall budget decision, not having the full thing. Because I take your point. You gotta make what, especially since it's one-time funding, like, you've got to make it transformational. It also can't set us up with a bunch of cliffs for personnel, right? So, like, you know, we've got to think that through. But to some extent, if you're going to get it out the door next year at some point, like, there's got to be a plan. So, but I'm sure we'll have further conversation on that. I more than exceeded my time, took total shares prerogative that time around. So I will go back to our list. And I think Councillor Braden, if you had any follow-ups, it would go to you, and then to Councillor Mejia and Flaherty if they have any follow-up questions. Councillor Braden?
Yeah, I think the conversation about declining enrollment and capture rate is worth a bigger conversation that we're not able to handle. You know, things like BPS preferences for exam schools would incentivize families to stay in the system. There's all sorts of possibilities to engineer that. And I also feel that the cost of housing in the city of Boston for families and families competing for housing with student rentals in our district particularly really impacts family choices about where they're going to end up staying. We see a lot of students leaving, families leaving when the kids are, 4 or 5 years old, and off they go. We never see them again. And that makes me very sad, because I think a neighborhood or a city without families is really not a good place to be. So I think that's a bigger conversation, an interdepartmental conversation. From that, I just feel that we have a lot of work to do, and I'm really thankful for all the great work that you folks are doing, and excited to continue this conversation about school budgets and all things related to school budgets in the coming weeks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Councillor Braden. Councillor Mejia?
Yes, thank you. I don't have chair prerogative, so you can mute me at any time, Councillor Bach. But, and Nate, I really do appreciate you being here and being so present. And I know that sometimes I look like I'm about to fight somebody, but just so you know, I'm just a very passionate individual. But I am very, this conversation is at my heart. having grown up here in the city of Boston and seeing all of and navigating every single Boston public school you could imagine and being bounced from place to place. I see the discrepancies across the entire city because I went to every Boston public school you could imagine. And, you know, in many ways, when I think about this conversation and the one that Councilor Bach was just having right now, you know, it's hard for me to say this, but I'm going to. It's just, it saddens me that the way that families feel about some of the Boston public schools is, it's like this whole idea of trying to squeeze us out of here. We're going to deplete these schools of every single resource so that families won't choose them. We're going to, you know, just not invest in them, because if we don't invest in them, then families will opt other places. It just feels to me that, you know, every single effort that is made to help improve the quality of our experiences, there's always a long pathway to get there. It's a 10-year plan. It's a 30-year vision. It's a community conversations. There's a whole bunch of a lot, and it just doesn't feel like things are changing and moving in the pace, which is why I get so frustrated about the conversation around our return, our investment. So at some point, we're going to have these conversations, and it can't be, we can't like just hang our coat on COVID and say, well, we can't because we have to address this. We're tired. We need to talk about it today. This can't be a conversation that we continue to put on pause, because families are opting out because we're not giving them any reason to really feel like what they're reimagining, they're going to be able to see for their own children. And I think that that's just something that I just need to say. It feels like we're being displaced out of our own schools. And we're forced to make these really tough decisions. And I think that, you know, accountability is key. And I definitely would like to see the city, you know, the district think about how we're going to measure up these dollars for dollars. But I want to just kind of ask some questions about Madison Park, which is one of the reasons why I think, you know, and I'm really grateful for Kevin McCaskill and all of the work that he has done over the last 5 or 6 years, and the Friends of Madison Park and all of the support that they've been able to receive. But yet, you know, they're not part of the investment plan. And so it's hard for people to believe that we're going to support Madison when we're not pouring dollars into supporting Madison. So the rhetoric is not matching up, right, for some folks. And so I just really want to know, can you talk a little bit more about how that study, to see how we're aligning with other vocational programs? What does that look like? And how are we leveraging our networks here? You know, everybody comes to Boston to go to school, to do business, but how are we leveraging these businesses that are doing business in Boston and holding them accountable to hiring our students for paid internships? Because a lot of kids have to juggle 2 to 3 jobs just to help support and just to keep a roof over their own heads here. So I want to talk about that. Like, what are we doing aside from just, you know, and if we can't have any money for Madison, what else can we do? Because Madison is on my top priority list here, just so you know, and also the McKinley and the McCormick. I'm curious about how we're going to, this is in regards to ELLs, right? We've seen a decrease in enrollment for ELL students in special education. And how are we conducting outreach specifically to parents of those students who are exiting our systems? Like, what does that look like? And when you say that students will have access to a social worker in every school, what does that look like? And how quickly will students be able to access these social workers, particularly in schools when we need it most? Like, you know, that's really beautiful that we're gonna have social workers in every school, but you know how many students need support? Do we have enough social workers for all of these students who are going to need these supports? Like, one in every school, when we have schools that have 200 or 300 students and all need help, like, how are we managing that? So before I go on, why don't you answer those questions, and I'll take a deep breath and ask one more.
So the simple answer on the social worker question is The allocation for social workers was based on total enrollment. And it was a per student enrollment, but it was also then based on student need. So we did differentiate the number of social workers at schools based on their size and some of the composition. And so that was the basic part. In terms of the nuances or some of the implementation questions that you were asking, I'm going to defer to that hearing, and I'll flag those questions for that team. They will be able to provide much more detailed answers. I don't want to give you a partial or mediocre answer on that. And I think the same thing is true for Madison Park and some of the overall vision. The study that I referenced to, the sort of first part in sort of building the vocational, a new vocational school, is understanding the alignment between industry. This is part of what other schools have done. So we have money in the budget for us to launch that study. It has been in the budget for, it was in last year's budget as well, but it did not get completed. And so we need to launch that project. I want to just say, in terms of we're not seeing an investment in Madison Park. One interesting thing was 4 or 5 years ago, when Madison Park was going through significant enrollment declines, or the enrollment had been down, we had gotten a lot of advocacy and pressure to fund Madison Park at a higher rate per pupil and give them more supplements outside of weighted student funding, so that they had the programming that they needed, the staff that they need, as enrollment then grows. And so as enrollment has grown, the supplement that we've given Madison Park has decreased. It actually shows one of the strategies of sort of breaking the cycle of enrollment declines. And so we made the investment so that more students will enroll, and we had the capacity. And now, as the capacity has increased, their tuition, their weighted student funding has increased, and the supplement has decreased. It's not that we're not investing, it's that we are getting one version of a return, not to try and shoehorn that expression in, but we are getting a return on that investment with the return of students. And I would say a lot more of your questions, I'm going to defer to the academic hearing when the career technical education team will be here as well.
Okay, so can you talk to me a little bit then about this hurry up and wait on syndrome that we have here in regards to addressing some of the deep racial inequities that we see across all of our schools? And at what point, I mean, I know you all are doing the best that you can. I'm just curious about what this moment in time is going to mean for that windfall that we're going to get. Into Counselor Bach's point, you know, I do think that it's not just about addressing COVID. I think we do have an opportunity to think about long-term and sustainable infrastructure, and it should not just be investments and then we're done, right? I think that we need to really plan for the future. And what I'm really concerned about, Nate, is at the end of the day, you know, the way the city is building and how the housing patterns are, we're going to be fighting for all of these great schools to be fixed, and then none of us are going to be able to live here and afford to reap those benefits. So I'm concerned about the families who are in the here and now and dealing with these situations right now. What are we going to do for those families who are in these schools today and tomorrow and next year and the next 3 to 5 years? What are we doing for them right now?
Yes, that tension that you are highlighting is one that, you know, as the CFO and as the person who's now coordinating the capital budget as well, Bill BPS, the tension between the sort of urgency and investing in the now and making those changes to respond to the conditions that we're in now, and then the deliberate sort of slow down, this is going to take us 10 years to do it the right way, or, you know, to rebuild all of our schools is going to take us decades. We need to balance the two. And there are times when we do not balance them well. We either respond only to the urgent or we slow everything down. I will say that we need to, you know, we need to be planting trees for the future, but that doesn't mean that we can't wait to provide the resources. So I think in the capital plan and in this plan, you are seeing investments in what students need now, while also trying to make some of the long-term structural and figuring out that right balance. And You know, I know it's something that the superintendent is impatient around the pace of change.
Yeah.
She wants us to be great now, and constantly putting that pressure on all of us on the leadership team. So I sort of wish she was here to hear this and respond to this. But you know, I will say that what you're highlighting is something that I spend a lot of time wrestling with, and that's not a direct answer, but it is one that I think there are a lot of people who are worried about the pace of change and needing to make lasting change. And when are you being deliberate versus when are you just being slow or bureaucratic?
And then no one's talked about the budget proposed for the McCormick. I'm just curious, we have a concrete number of what that investment is going to look like? And I know, Councilor Bach, that's the last question, I promise.
The budget for the McCormick is the operating budget is now under a combined BCLA McCormick 7 through 12. And you see the combined school and the investments that we're making. We are making significant investments to transition that school to a 7 to 12 and to support them as they operate on 2 campuses next year. That funding can be found on our supplemental school allocation sheet. You can see there's a cost to operating the school in 2 locations and launching this new program. In addition, in the capital budget, there is funding for the McCormick site, which is the home that will be the future home of BCLA McCormick 7 through 12. And I think we're also planning to launch a renaming process for that new 7 to 12 school. That we're thinking about that project in multiple phases. There's the first phase, which is what are the basic renovations that we need to have in place to operate it as a high school instead of just a standalone middle school. And then the broader sort of what is the vision for the school and how do we roll that out over the next few years. It's a multi-year project that's starting design right now for renovations over the summer and fall. And then each year we're going to be making upgrades. And then the last thing I'll just say about this is there's money in the budget for the McCormick Dever site because we know that there are issues and how do we use the outdoor space on the site. And then there's also the project related to the Boys and Girls Club that's going there, which our students will have access to for extracurricular activities and other uses.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate and Councilor Mejia. I do want to let Councilor Flaherty get in for a second round. So Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nathan, just want to direct your attention. I know you had talked about, we're just talking about declining school enrollment. So, and you did concede, so you opened the door that you're from out in Worcester County. So let you know how it works around here. And how it works around here is the parents get the school assignment letter in the mail. And if they get the school of their choice, it's like hitting the lottery and they stick around. If they don't, they obviously try to get the next best school. In some instances, they'll pull out, go to a charter school, and or if they can afford it, they'll go to a parochial school. Or worse, if they're unassigned or get a chronically underperforming school, they it's pretty much hasta la vista y bueno suerte. So that said, also in addition, the property tax bills that just come out, that's also going to chase people out of the city. You could choke a horse on those percentages at a time when people are struggling, coming through the pandemic, trying to get back to work, trying to open up their businesses. And on top of that, they get walloped with a nice Prop 2.5 gift in property taxes that, quite frankly, should have been deferred. And obviously, the competition that we get, and competition's good. It's healthy. We're about to start, our re-election efforts ourselves for district and at large. We've got a race for mayor. Competition is good. It's healthy. Gets you up early. It keeps you up later. You got to be sharp. You got to be focused. You got to work on issues. You got to address constituent service issues, et cetera, to earn your opportunity to be re-elected and or elected in those instances. And so we've got charter school competition. We've got private school competition. We've got parochial school competition. Wherever folks have the ability to and the means to sustain that for their children. And that's the primary and fundamental obligation of parents is the education of their children. So we may not see the families that are having 7, 8, 9, 10 kids when when we were younger, but it's really about quality, and it's the school assignment piece on top of property tax, which is driving people from the city in search of better value for their tax dollars, in search of a good quality school. And so that's the reality of it. That's what happens, Nathan, when they get the school assignment. People are either hugging and high-fiving and jumping for joy, or they're looking for alternatives. And sadly, one of the alternatives is they move out of Boston. And so obviously we need to sort of change that trajectory. So I guess the question for me is, how are we funding the chronically underperforming schools? How are we funding schools that consistently have declining school enrollment, so that we can get them out of that cycle, that downward cycle? And if you think about the schools that we celebrate and we've got success, there's some common denominators there. There's a strong school leadership, there's strong parental support, and there's a popular buzz, down at the ball fields and in the communities, and people rally around our schools. We've had great success in Boston with parents and students rallying for their school and school pride, and I think that's a big piece of this. So anything that can be done to sort of turn around our underperforming schools and encourage folks and parents in particular to get involved and to help create that buzz, it'll be a rising tide. So that's my 2 cents on it, Nathan, and appreciate your attention to detail. I know you're up to your eyeballs as we go through this budget process, but those are the facts. I mean, that's just, as a citywide councilor and as the longest serving, those are the stories that I hear across the city in every single neighborhood. They open up the letter, they get the school of their choice. That's a great day. If not, then they're searching for alternatives. And one of the alternatives is that they move out of our city and or they choose a non-BPS school. And we need to reverse that trend.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It is funny. I've now lived in Boston longer than I've lived anywhere else. And in the house that I currently live in, longer than in any house I ever have been in. But I would never claim to be a Bostonian in the same way. I wear it with pride, but I think we have a lot of people here who are born and raised in Boston who have a particular pride in that. I have 2 children of my own, and I remember going through the process and know exactly what you're talking about. And I think with a lot of our schools and our elementary schools, we have a lot of great schools who are doing great work that families should be giving more of a chance. And I think sometimes the way that families talk about some of our schools are quite honestly, they're loaded with implications around neighborhoods and race. I also think we don't do ourselves any favors with the quality of some of our school buildings. And I can remember walking through a lot of the schools as I'm thinking about it for my family, and thinking about like the quality of the school building, the school facility. My son and daughter attend, I think the 4th oldest school building still in use that was built before 1900. And there are parts of it that I think are charming and wonderful, and there are parts of it that make me upset as a parent. And that is my motivation and the sort of fire I bring to build BPS, to make sure that we make those choices. I do think we can do more to expand opportunities and let people know what great things are happening in BPS. And in terms of supporting schools with declining enrollment and creating and building on quality, I do think part of the reason that we've talked about our footprint is it is hard for us to maintain 125 schools with declining enrollment and provide consistent resources across all of these buildings. We need to start thinking about how do we create and consolidate some of our schools. And that is a difficult conversation that we've been teasing for multiple years. I think it's better to do through new school buildings. We build a new school building and families get to go in and share in a new experience, as opposed to some of the consolidations we've done in the past, where it's in response to declining enrollment and they're not getting anything new. They're just moving into a different building. So obviously this is a big topic and conversation, but I appreciate what you're saying in terms of that experience. The family experience is something that is pretty intense in Boston for sure.
And I will just add, obviously, there is a lot of great things happening within our Boston Public Schools. We got a lot of committed and dedicated teachers and other professionals that are rallying for our children. And we also got a lot of great things going on in our city. We boast of the best colleges and universities in the world. And we just want to make sure that we're preparing all of our students for the opportunity to access those schools and to be able to compete and get in those schools and thrive in our global economy.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Flaherty. I just have a quick set of, I think, second round questions, which are mainly, how do we think about, I have in my district both the EMK and the Snowden, which have multiple buildings as like they're multi-building campuses and really multi-site, right? And I'm just curious, Miriam, I mean, this is also a question for Nate, but I just like, how do you factor in when some of the efficiencies of having a janitor who can just walk down the hall versus a janitor who has to like bop around between different sites, like how do those things get managed? And then along the way, if there's anything I should know about the Snowden and the Kennedy specifically, I know for the Kennedy, we had a sort of relocation of part of it from kind of the northeastern side to the Wentworth side. And if you've got more details on that, that would be great. But also, so both anything on Kennedy and Snowden, but also kind of how do we factor in that kind of facilities set up in our budgeting?
I know
I
you.
think she asked you, Miriam.
I know, but I think I'm going to kick it back to Nate, but I appreciate it.
No, I think you're absolutely right in terms of, you know, when we think about some of these resources that become inefficient when you have to operate two sites. We do give a second site allocation to different schools based on their distance and whether or not they need to hire a second secretary or whether they need a second administrator on site for the second site. There's also custodial costs that come from the inefficiency of two different sites. So consolidating onto a single site for most of our schools would be a much preferable, I think, for the school communities than operating over two sites. And, you know, that goes, transportation costs us more money. We have double the costs of sometimes the food services staff and just the social workers when we start doing these per pupil allocations, nurses, all of these things add up so that if you can consolidate into a more efficient school, you can reallocate some of those resources and maintain access to nurse, social worker at the same ratios. And also then provide some of the other things that we want to do. The Snowden, in terms of operating, they have multiple sites. I know that the Clarendon site is going through a transfer of ownership. We're working with them on that to maintain the long-term plan for Snowden at that site. And then EMK has developed a new partnership with Wentworth. They are no longer operating at the Connors Hall at Northeastern, and we're moving to Wentworth. That is for this spring. We're working with Wentworth. That's an exciting new partnership. Still working with them about the sort of long-term placement potential for EMK, but that is currently in discussion and don't have any further updates on that.
Okay, well, I would love to be in the loop on that. I think it's exciting. Obviously, Wentworth has also collaborated, you know, with you all and Councilor Flaherty around the Year 13 initiative, and just, yeah, great partner. I'd also love to be part of, you know, I think this has been a topic of conversation at large lately, but like part of, you know, how do we get our hospitals partnered with? I mean, EMK is the obvious place for that, and it just feels like there's untapped potential on that front.
Absolutely.
I do want to note we've been rejoined by Councilor Campbell, so I want to give her an opportunity for any follow-up questions she didn't get to ask in her first round.
I'll just say I was, my chief of staff, Ellie, was on, so we'll definitely connect with her. I think many of the questions I was going to ask, you asked, Councilor Mejia actually asked a series of questions on the Mckinley schools as well, which is near and dear. So we'll just follow. I don't want to take too much time and save questions for the additional budget here, BPS budget hearings. Thank you.
Great, excellent, yes. And we'll definitely follow up on further sort of like, you know, info that didn't get answered today. And obviously we'll be having the council working sessions to generate more of those requests in advance of the future hearings as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Councilor Campbell. Councilor Mejia, I saw that your hand went back up, so I wanted to check, since we're moving towards the end, if you had another set of questions.
When are we done for this hearing? I just don't want to hold anyone hostage.
So I think we're nearing the end. I'm gonna see whether, I don't have anybody signed up for public testimony. I do have a Jamie Roccanelli in the waiting room. I don't know if he's anybody's staff or she or they. Sorry.
Yeah, Jamie's our director of planning analysis. He oversees all of our enrollment projections. He's been helping me sound like I know what I'm talking about on some of that.
Okay, so he's been behind the curtain.
Don't let him public. No, I'm just kidding. He's not there for public comment.
Yeah, I just had a quick follow-up about the Mckinley. You know, just a little detail that I think it's important for us to highlight here is that staffing changes could lead to continuing this funding and enrollment cycle, like the fewer teachers and staff programming and other services may decrease. So I'm just curious, like, how are we reconciling with that?
That enrollment cycle and sort of cuts to programming can lead to declines in enrollment. Certainly applies to our sort of traditional schools, traditional high schools. The Mckinley is a programmatic school and it's one of our special education day schools. Enrollment is placement driven and is based on a student's IEP and has less to do with sort of demand than it does about the appropriate placement. And I've now probably exceeded my knowledge about the placement process and would defer to our special education hearing to be able to give better information about placement. When we have 6 schools that are funded outside of weighted student funding, there are schools that are not funded based on their enrollment. Those schools include the Mckinley, Carter School, and the Horace Mann School for the deaf and hard of hearing. Those are 3 certified day schools, special education schools. Mm-hmm. It also includes Community Academy, Boston Adult Technical Academy, and then Newcomers Academy.
Yep.
So all of those schools, when we do the budgeting, it's a conversation with the school leaders about what their program needs to be and what the staff they need to serve the kids that they have. And we fund at capacity, not at sort of response to enrollment in the same way. And so I'm not as concerned with adjustments to their budget leading to the same sort of declining quality because it was done in partnership with the school leader.
So, you know, one last question. I'm going back to Madison. You know, I understand that there are families who understand how to work the system. So there might be a program that's not provided at Madison and they are able to opt out of our district and then they get shipped somewhere else to get that quality experience elsewhere. And so knowing that, and that doesn't that cost us money, right? Aren't we paying for those out of placement districts? Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, like how many families are taking advantage of those opportunities? And do you know what the racial breakdown are of those families?
I can get that information. We certainly have that information. The one that comes to mind, because I was just in a conversation about the Norfolk agricultural program. I think there's something like 30 students who are enrolling out there. We do then pay those for those vocational programs, similar to like if a student gets placed in out of district special education, it costs us. So I can pull the enrollment for each of those out of district vocational programs and then the demographic breakdown for each of them.
And then how that is impacting our financials, right? So if we're able to offer those programs here, right, then we could keep our students here. Right. Mm-hmm. And if we're, you know, I just think in terms of investments and we're really serious about how we support Madison, then maybe we need to start thinking about where we're allowing our dollars to be reallocated. And we can keep those families here. We can keep those dollars here and we can keep Madison here. And more importantly, to Councilor Flaherty's point, make Madison the gold standard of voc tech. I mean, we should really be striving for that, especially in Boston. We're supposed to be the mecca of education, and yet we can't even compete with our other districts in terms of voc tech. So we have a lot to do, Nate, and you know I'm here for all of it. I've been here for all of it. I'm not going anywhere, whether I get elected or I'm here for all of it. I'm just letting you all know, because this is something that is dear and near to me. And I think that, you know, as we continue to have the conversation about education, I think that we have an opportunity to really put Boston on the map and do our due diligence to show what urban education really looks like when we're committed to financially supporting the investments and the time and energy and having those difficult conversations. And we have to also look at the fact of the matter is that my daughter is at the BTU. And, you know, I waited years to Councilor Flaherty's point in terms of what it looks like to get into one of the higher performing schools in the city of Boston, especially if you don't live in those neighborhoods, right? You can't afford to live in those neighborhoods, then it's a chance of luck if you get to send your child to one of the higher performing schools. And I think that also, we need to look at that. We also need to look at who are how we, just by the mere fact of how enrollment trends happen, how we're creating more segregated schools. This is the first time that my daughter's going to a school that is so diverse. I've seen more white families since school is now back in session, you know, in one area that is just incredibly like inspiring to be in a space that's so culturally diverse. But that's not the case for all of the city of Boston. And, you know, not to talk about segregation, but the fact of the matter is that we are, as a district, continuing to channel people into certain areas and keep them there. And we can't have a real conversation about equity unless we're really ready to be honest about how our enrollment patterns and how our kids get assigned, even though it's supposed to be like, I don't know if it's a genie in a bottle or how these things happen. But what I do know is that segregation is real, and that also drives the inequity and the financial investments that are made or not made in Boston Public Schools. And we can't talk about equity unless we're really talking about the realities. And I think that the conversation has lived in education, but I think a lot of these issues, we need to start thinking about this conversation through civil rights, because at some point there's going to have to be a level of accountability that goes beyond the education committee. Because if we're really serious about this work, then we're going to have to do some serious interventions to get us to where we need to be. Otherwise, it's just going to be the same old, and next year I'm going to be asking the same questions and going to be getting the same responses. But I do appreciate all of this time and energy that you do pour into all of those fabulous PowerPoints, and how committed you are to, no matter how hard we go, you always come back and participate. So thank you to you and your team for all your hard work. It does not go unnoticed, but we need more of it.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. I think with that, I don't have any public testimony, and I think we have indeed occupied the BPS team's time for much of the day. I'm looking forward, as Councilor Mejia says, to more of it. But I do just want to, I feel like we would be remiss not to end this school budgets hearing by noting that obviously, you know, we spent a lot of the time talking about the declining enrollment. You guys made a decision to significantly buffer all of our schools from impacts on declining enrollment. And there is a parallel universe in which this hearing is going on for 10 hours and everyone in the city of Boston is here because everybody's schools are seeing the kind of cuts that like send us more into that death spiral. And so I feel like it's important to say, you know, you guys made a choice and a decision there. I think it was the right one. I think that in the light of the COVID situation that we're in, as you said, Nate, with so many people just still sort of tumbling through this moment and what it's meant for all of our families, that to then be hitting everybody with cuts across the board would have been really hard. And we don't have to look very far to know what that looks like, because it's what most of our like urban school systems across America are grappling with. And for sure, the ARP funding is riding to the rescue for people to some extent. But, you know, it's also probably worth putting on the record that in Boston, we're able to talk about that money as this potential moonshot for transformation, because we're not talking about pouring it all into the hole of revenue replacement because of, you know, the fortunate position that we're in vis-a-vis, you know, pretty resilient revenues and obviously the upheld pre-COVID commitment from the city operating budget to BPS. So, you know, I wanted to register that there are choices that have been made, both by this council in supporting that operating budget infusion last year, by Mayor Walsh, by Mayor Janey in the proposal, and by you guys in terms of allocation that make this a very different hearing than it could be.
Well, I appreciate that close on that note. I think that's if there was one thing that I think we wanted to emphasize going into this, it is the amount of work we did to stabilize the student experience.